The wild Mustang had to be found in 24 hours, or Edward would lose $50 million. $500,000 as a reward for finding the animal was money thrown away. But he had no choice. When Chloe, the desperate veterinarian, brought the injured horse from the ravine, Edward saw the horseshoe-shaped scar on its leg. What it meant froze his heart forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Do you believe some coincidences are signs of destiny? The story starts now. Edward Santana signed dismissals like signing autographs. The gold pen glided over the letterhead as 17 families lost their livelihood on an ordinary Thursday. At 57, the agribusiness magnate had learned that feelings were a luxury rich men couldn't afford. His secretary placed another stack of documents before him, lease agreements that would evict small producers from lands their families had cultivated for generations. Mr. Edward, John from Hope Ranch is outside. He wants to talk about the eviction, she murmured, avoiding his eyes. Edward didn't even lift his head. Tell him the deadline has passed. I don't do charity. In the mirror behind his desk, he saw the reflection of a man who had built a $200 million empire by trampling anything that showed weakness. His 125,000-acre ranch was a testament to a simple philosophy. Compassion didn't pay bills, and regret was a word he had erased from his vocabulary. Family. His wife had left him 5 years earlier, taking the children who barely knew him. Friends. That species had been extinct in his world for decades. The phone rang. It was Robert, his partner in the mining company. The voice on the other end trembled with anxiety. Edward, we have a problem. That wild horse appeared again on the Golden Valley lands. The mining crew won't go in while it's there. Stupid superstition about a sacred Native American animal. Edward snorted. The Golden Valley lands were his biggest play. $50 million from the sale, plus $200 million in gold extraction participation. A wild Mustang wouldn't destroy decades of planning. How much does it cost to get rid of a horse? Can't kill it. Environmentalists are watching. We need to capture and relocate it. But the animal is smart. It escapes every time. You have until tomorrow at noon, or the buyers back out. Edward hung up and punched the table. He pulled out his checkbook and scribbled $500,000, an absurd amount that represented less than a week's profit, but which could solve the problem. He would post the reward online. $500,000 for anyone who brought the Mustang alive in 24 hours. 2 hours later, he was driving his armored Mercedes toward Golden Valley when a tire went flat on the dirt road. The 104-degree Fahrenheit heat turned the car into a furnace. No cell signal, no mechanic, just the deafening silence of the remote plains. That's when he heard the whinnies. He followed the sound to a hidden ravine where a black Mustang was trapped between rocks, its hind leg bleeding. The animal was magnificent, defined muscles under its dark coat, a wild mane swaying in the wind, eyes that had never known a bridle or saddle. Clearly, a young adult, perhaps 8 years old, strong despite the desperate situation. Edward started to head back to the car. It wasn't his problem. He had meetings, contracts, money waiting, but something about the horseshoe-shaped scar on the animal's leg made him stop. A strange mark, almost like, no, impossible. He took off his $1,500 suit jacket and descended into the ravine. Not out of kindness. It would be ridiculous to lose $50 million because of an injured animal when the solution was right there, groaning in the scorching heat. It was an investment, nothing more. An hour of manual labor to secure the biggest deal of his life. The Mustang didn't resist when Edward freed it from the rocks and carried it out of the ravine. Sweat stained his Italian shirt, dirt soiled his leather shoes, but the horse was alive, and alive meant $50 million. The nearest veterinarian was 25 miles away. Edward drove, with the unconscious Mustang in the bed of a pickup truck borrowed from a local rancher, his thoughts oscillating between irritation and a strange restlessness he couldn't name. The horseshoe scar on the animal's leg bothered him inexplicably. Pure Mustang, Dr. Miller confirmed after examining the horse. Male, approximately 8 years old, born wild, never domesticated. That scar is natural, a rare birthmark, but it happens. The animal is dehydrated and traumatized, but it will survive. How long until he's transportable? 2 weeks of minimum recovery. But Mr. Edward, this horse cannot be sold or kept in captivity. It's protected by federal law. Edward gritted his teeth. 2 weeks. The deadline with the mining company expired in 18 hours. He grabbed his cell phone and dialed every environmental agency he knew, offering bribes disguised as donations. Nothing. Federal bureaucracy didn't move for money, only for paperwork that took months. He was cornered with an injured Mustang that was worth $50 million, but couldn't be touched. He returned to the ranch, but couldn't concentrate. During the meeting with the board, he lost the thread of conversation 3 times. On the call with Japanese investors, he signed the wrong contract. His mind always returned to the Mustang, to that scar, to the disturbing feeling of having seen that mark before. "Boss, are you okay?" asked Mark, his right-hand man for 15 years. Edward didn't answer. For the first time in decades, he cancelled his business dinner and drove back to the veterinarian. He found the Mustang standing, drinking water, its black eyes studying his every move with wild intelligence. The animal showed no fear or gratitude, only the natural caution of one who had never trusted humans. "I'll call him Thunder," Edward murmured, surprised by his own words. How long had it been since he named something unrelated to profit? That night, alone in his office, Edward researched wild horses of Golden Valley. The internet was scarce on information, but he found an academic article from 2010 about American Mustangs. The author mentioned a study begun in the 90s by a retired veterinarian who catalogued the natural markings of the animals in the region. Edward's blood ran cold when he read the researcher's name. Dr. Anthony Santana, his father. His hands trembled as he clicked the link. The page loaded slowly, revealing black and white photographs of wild horses. In the third image, Edward saw a foal with a distinctive mark on its leg, a horseshoe-shaped scar identical to Thunder's. The caption read, "Foal born in 1995, Golden Valley, first record of the horseshoe lineage. Research interrupted due to the passing of Dr. Anthony in 1998. 1995. Edward was 28 when his father died. 28 years wasted on a stupid fight about the future of the family ranch. 28 years without speaking to the man who had dedicated the last years of his life studying wild horses while his son built an empire, destroying everything his father loved." The phone rang. It was the mining company confirming if the horse wasn't gone by tomorrow at noon, the deal was cancelled. Edward hung up and stared at the photo on the screen. Thunder wasn't just any Mustang. He was a direct descendant of the horses his father had spent years protecting and studying. Golden Valley wasn't just a profitable property. It was the last sanctuary Anthony had left behind. Edward didn't sleep. At 5 in the morning, he drove to the abandoned homestead where his father had lived his last years. The same homestead Edward had refused to visit while the man agonized alone in a hospital bed. The house was in ruins, but the back shed remained intact. Inside, he found dust-covered boxes with decades of research, handwritten notebooks, photographs, detailed maps of the Mustang's movements. His father's trembling handwriting documented every animal, every birth, every death. Edward opened the last notebook and saw the date. December 1997, 2 months before Anthony's death. "Edward hasn't returned my calls in 3 years. Today I saw the horseshoe foal again. It's grown strong and healthy. When my son returns, I'll show him that not everything needs to be destroyed to create value. The Mustangs are the true treasure of Golden Valley." Edward turned the page and found a yellowed letter addressed to him, never sent. "Son, I know you're angry with me for not selling the land. I know you think I'm a foolish old man, wasting opportunities. But come by tomorrow. I want to show you something that will change your perspective on what is truly worth preserving. The Mustangs taught me that legacy isn't measured in money. It's measured in the life we allow to continue existing after we're gone. The letter was dated January 15th, 1998. Edward remembered that day perfectly. He had received 5 calls from Anthony, all ignored because he was closing the acquisition of a feed mill. His father died 3 days later of a massive heart attack, alone in the rural hospital, never having been able to show his son his life's work. Edward folded the letter and put it in his pocket. At the bottom of the last box, he found a detailed map of Golden Valley with notes on Mustang escape routes. His father had spent 8 years mapping every trail, every hiding place, every water source the animals used. He knew that land better than any owner. His cell phone rang. It was Chloe, the unemployed veterinarian who had responded to the reward ad. "Mr. Edward, I found tracks of the Mustang you're looking for. I can take you to him in 2 hours. Edward closed his eyes. 2 hours. Enough time to capture Thunder, turn him over to the authorities, and ensure the Golden Valley mining went ahead as planned. $50 million awaited a simple decision. But when he arrived at the meeting spot and saw Chloe, a 35-year-old woman in mended clothes, and the tired eyes of someone struggling to support 2 young children, something churned in his stomach. She desperately needed that money. He could see it in her slumped shoulders, her calloused hands, the way she avoided looking directly at his luxury car. "Why do you need this reward so much?" Edward asked. "I'll lose my house on Friday if I don't pay the foreclosure. $500,000 would solve my life and my children's." Edward nodded and followed Chloe down the trail that led to Thunder's hiding place. With each step, he felt the weight of the letter in his pocket and the growing certainty that he was about to betray his father's last wish to make money he didn't even need. When they reached the clearing and saw Thunder grazing peacefully, Edward realized that the most important decision of his life didn't involve $50 million. It involved choosing between the man he had become and the son his father had hoped he would be. Edward stood watching Thunder for long minutes. The Mustang raised its head and stared at them with cautious curiosity, the horseshoe scar clearly visible in the sunlight. Chloe prepared the rope and mild sedative, efficient movements of someone who understood wild animals. "He's recovered," she murmured, "strong enough for transport." Edward pulled out his cell phone. 1 call and Thunder would be removed from Golden Valley in 2 hours. Mining would begin on Monday. $50 million would be in his account by Tuesday. But his father's letter felt like it was burning a hole in his shirt pocket. "Chloe, what would you do if you had $50 million? She stopped preparing the equipment and stared at him in surprise. "I'd pay off my house, put my kids in a decent school, save the rest for emergencies. Why? What if I told you this horse is worth more than $50 million to me?" "I'd say you've lost your mind." Edward laughed, his first genuine laugh in years. He called Robert, his mining partner. "The deal is off." "What? Edward, are you kidding? That's $50 million. The horse stays where it is. The land will not be sold." "Have you gone mad? The investors will sue us. We have signed contracts." Edward hung up and called his lawyer. 2 hours later, he had liquidated 3 smaller investments to pay the contractual penalties. He lost $12 million in penalties, plus the $50 million he gave up. On paper, it was the worst deal of his career. Chloe watched him as if he had lost his sanity. "Mr. Edward, are you sure? That's a lot of money." "I'm sure." Edward pulled out his checkbook and filled out $500,000 for her. "Your reward. You found the horse." Chloe's hands trembled as she took the check. "But I didn't deliver him." "Yes, you did. You delivered back to me something I had lost 26 years ago." That afternoon, Edward drove alone to his father's grave. It was the first time he had visited the cemetery since the burial. The simple headstone read only, Dr. Anthony Santana, veterinarian, loved life in all its forms. Edward took the letter from his pocket and read it aloud to the silent stone. Dad, it took me 26 years, but I finally understood what you wanted to show me. Thunder is safe, Golden Valley is safe, and I'm going to try to be the son you believed I could be. A gentle breeze rustled the surrounding trees. Edward closed his eyes, and for the first time since childhood cried. He cried for the lost opportunities, the unanswered calls, the years wasted building a fortune on the rubble of everything that truly mattered. When he stood up, he had made a decision. He called Mark, his right-hand man. I want you to turn Golden Valley into a permanent reserve for wild mustangs. Hire the best environmental lawyer in the country. I want legal protection that no future government can overturn. Boss, that will cost a fortune and yield no return. Edward smiled, looking toward the horizon where Thunder and his herd grazed freely. The return isn't measured in money, Mark. My father tried to teach me that. It took me a while, but I finally learned. The transformation had begun, and this time there was no turning back. 6 months later, Edward sold his third luxury property to finance the Anthony Santana Reserve. The 5,400 square foot penthouse apartment in New York City was exchanged for a simple 3-bedroom house in Golden Valley, 15 minutes from the reserve. His former partners called him crazy. His ex-wife laughed when she heard he was playing ecologist. Edward no longer cared about others' opinions. Every morning, he walked to the reserve fence with a thermometer and clipboard, noting Mustang behaviors just as his father had done decades earlier. Thunder had become the herd leader, 12 wild horses that now graze safely on 7,500 acres, protected by federal law. The first restitution was the most difficult. Edward drove to the low-income neighborhood where Ms. Eleanor, the elderly woman he had evicted 3 years earlier to build a shopping center, lived. She opened the plywood door and stared at him with a mixture of fear and anger. I've come to return your home, Edward said, extending the deed. Ms. Eleanor took the paper with trembling hands. What? Your old house? I bought it back from the current owner. It's registered in your name, no conditions, no interest, no deadline. It's yours. The woman didn't smile. She didn't thank him. She just studied him for long seconds before closing the door. Edward walked down the hill, knowing he had started a debt impossible to repay completely, but that he needed to try. The second restitution was with John, the farmer he had evicted to expand his businesses. He found the man working on a leased property, his dignity broken but not destroyed. Edward returned John's family's ancestral lands plus $500,000 in compensation. Why are you doing this? John asked, suspicious. Because my father taught me that a legacy isn't built by destroying others. John accepted the keys, but his eyes remained hard. True forgiveness, Edward was learning, didn't automatically come with financial restitution. The reserve project grew. Edward hired 5 biologists, built a research center, and established a permanent foundation with $30 million, half of his personal fortune. The Anthony Santana Foundation would be dedicated exclusively to the protection of wild horses throughout the United States. During a meeting with environmentalists, Edward met Dr. Ryan, a young veterinarian who studied equine behavior. The young man reminded Edward of himself at 25, brilliant, ambitious, but with his heart still intact. Dr. Ryan, Edward said after the meeting, would you like to be the scientific director of the foundation? Mr. Edward, with all due respect, why does a businessman like you care about wild horses? Edward led Ryan to the fence where Thunder grazed with the herd. The horseshoe scar was visible even from a distance. My father dedicated the last years of his life studying these animals while I was busy making money. When he died, I ignored everything he had built. Finding Thunder gave me a second chance to honor his work. Ryan accepted the position. That night, alone on the porch, Edward reread his father's research for the 100th time. The meticulous notes, the detailed drawings, the genuine love for each documented animal. For the first time in decades, Edward felt he was building something that would last beyond his own life, something his father would approve of, something worth more than any accumulated fortune. 2 years had passed. Edward, now 59, woke before dawn to accompany the reserve's monitoring patrols. Thunder, at 10 years old, showed the first signs of maturity, some graying hairs on his muzzle, slightly less agile movements. In the wild, a Mustang rarely lived beyond 15, 17 years. Time, Edward had learned, was a more precious resource than money. The Anthony Santana Foundation already protected 125,000 acres in 4 states, sheltering 200 wild horses. The research center had published 3 international studies on wild equine behavior, frequently citing Dr. Anthony Santana's pioneering work from the 90s. "Your father would be proud," Dr. Ryan said during a walk through the reserve. His work inspired an entire generation of researchers. Edward smiled, watching Thunder teach young foals to find water in dry seasons. He always knew that true legacy is measured by the life we allow to continue after we're gone. That afternoon, Edward received an unexpected visit. Charles Miller, a 45-year-old businessman who had been his fiercest competitor for decades, appeared at the reserve's gate driving an armored Mercedes identical to the one Edward had owned years earlier. "I came to see with my own eyes the man who lost his mind," Charles said, stepping out of the car with a cynical smile. Edward Santana, the agribusiness king, playing animal protector. Edward received him on the porch of the simple house, serving coffee in plain ceramic mugs, no longer the English porcelain service he had displayed for decades. "How is Mary?" Edward asked about Charles's wife. "Hospitalized. 3rd heart attack. The doctors say the business stress. Anyway, she always complained I never stopped to breathe." Charles looked away. "I came here because I need to understand. How does a man abandon $200 million to care for horses?" Edward pointed to the fence, where Thunder grazed peacefully with his family. "I didn't abandon anything, Charles. I finally found what I'd been looking for 30 years without knowing it." "And what would that be?" "Peace." Charles was silent for a few minutes, watching the Mustangs. "My son hasn't spoken to me in 2 years. He says I chose money over his family." "Is that true?" Charles sighed deeply. "Perhaps it is." Edward didn't try to convert Charles or give unsolicited advice. He had learned that every man needed to find his own path to redemption. He offered only, "The reserve is always open for visits." That night, alone on the porch, Edward reread one of the last letters his father had written, recently found among old papers. "Edward, if you are ever reading this, I hope you have found your way back home. Not the house of bricks, but the home of the heart. The Mustangs taught me that it's never too late to return to the herd, to remember who we are when we stop running." Edward folded the letter carefully. On the other side of the fence, Thunder raised his head, as if sensing his presence. For a moment, man and horse stared at each other through the darkness, 2 survivors who had found their place in the world. Edward had discovered that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about using the remaining time to sow something different, something that would grow long after his last breath. On the 3rd anniversary of the Anthony Santana Foundation, over 200 people gathered at the reserve. Environmentalists, researchers, families Edward had harmed and later helped, children from local schools who now visited the reserve monthly to learn about conservation. Edward, at 60, watched the crowd from the porch. Some faces still carried resentment, wounds that money couldn't completely heal. Others showed genuine gratitude. Most simply saw him as he was now, a man trying to make up for lost decades through concrete actions. Thunder, at 11, remained majestic despite his advanced age. Some completely grey hairs, slower movements, but still the undisputed leader of the herd. Edward knew there were only a few years left together, a reality he had learned to accept without bitterness. During the ceremony, Dr. Ryan presented the numbers: 300 wild horses protected, 15 researchers working full-time, 4 books published about the legacy of Dr. Anthony Santana. The work would continue long beyond Edward's life. "Your father would be proud," Ryan announced. "He always knew that true legacy is measured by the life we allow to continue after we're gone." "I'd like to call the founder of the reserve to the stage," Ryan announced. Edward walked to the makeshift microphone. There was no prepared speech. He spoke directly from the heart. "My father spent the last years of his life protecting these animals, while I was busy destroying everything he loved. When I found him injured in that ravine, Thunder gave me something money can't buy: a second chance." He pointed to the mustangs grazing peacefully. "These horses owe me nothing. I owe them. They taught me that true legacy isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by the life we allow to continue existing after we're gone." After the ceremony, Edward walked alone to the fence where Thunder rested. The mustang approached, not like a domesticated animal seeking affection, but like an old companion recognizing a familiar presence. "Thank you, my friend," Edward murmured, "for showing me the way back home." Thunder snorted softly and returned to the herd. Edward watched until the sunset painted the sky orange and red. That night, he wrote in his diary, a habit he had developed since the reserve's creation: "I can't go back and be the son my father deserved, the husband my ex-wife needed, or the father my children wanted. But I can be different today and tomorrow, and for the time I have left. Anthony believed in second chances. Thunder gave me mine. Now it's my turn to pass that on." He closed the notebook and looked out the window. Outside, under the moonlight, Thunder watched over his sleeping herd, as he had done every night for the past 3 years. A silent guardian protecting what mattered. Edward had discovered that true value in life isn't measured by what we achieve for ourselves, but by what we preserve for others. Outside, the wind blew softly through the valley, carrying the sounds of wildlife that would continue to exist long after both Edward and Thunder became just memories. But memories, he had discovered, were seeds. And the best seeds always sprouted long after winter passed. This story is about regret, about calls we didn't make, lost opportunities to say, "I love you," years wasted chasing things that don't matter while ignoring people who do. If you have someone you love, but are distant from out of pride, out of anger, out of being too busy, don't wait to need a wild horse to teach you what's truly worthwhile. Call, write, show up, because unlike Edward, you still have time. And if this story reminded you of someone, or if you believe in second chances, share it. We never know who needs to hear this today. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.